Tread carefully, we are about to enter the threshold of faerieland, and the fae do not take kindly to strangers, and even less humans. Join me as we discover these portals and I document my findings with pen and ink. Pay close attention as these cautious creatures reveal themselves. At first, it may be hard to see the signs of the fae in your surroundings, but the more you notice, the more you begin to see, including their traps too. Most human folk cannot see the fae with their natural eyesight, but as I have discovered more and more fae corners, I have trained my eyes to notice the signs that they are around. I often see a glimmer in my periphery and often become overcome with a water-like shimmer that takes over my vision, and I have to lie down for the rest of the day. I have oftentimes wondered if a pygmy fae is curled up in my ear, the tip of their boot poking the insides, creating the pain that spreads across my temple. A good indicator the fae may like residing in a particular zone is if you notice hoof prints or animal fur in the surrounding areas. If an area is rich in diverse vegetation, wildflowers and mushrooms, and mostly untouched by human hands, it is likely the fae would have at least scouted the area for a spot to reside or do mischief. The fae live in a strange liminal space between nature and humans, both wanting to interfere while furiously protecting what is most precious to them. They can't quite decide if they want to be left entirely alone, as once they were much more united and involved in the lives of humans. Now they are even more scarce to us. To document these fae happenings, I am using a fine platinum desk fountain pen with black carbon ink cartridges and a Derwent Soft Touch sketchbook, 200 GSM acid-free paper. You'll notice I use this fountain pen nib upside down a fair amount, as I find the paper is quite absorbent and using it like this creates an even finer line. There is actually an even finer version of this fountain pen, but I couldn't actually find one for myself. This first portal is quite a subtle example of the fae, although it is through these moments that we first begin to adjust our eyes to them. These lands, full of wildflowers, berry bushes and vines, often have a habit of growing foliage that is either spiky or grips onto you in some way. As I was walking, checking on our trees after a storm, I discovered the first upon tripping on a bramble vine, although now I wonder if I was in fact tripped by a cantankerous fae creature that lassoed me with it. As I was picking the thorns from my ankle, I looked up. Something shimmering caught my eye, perfectly suspended above a pink foxglove. I covered my eyes with my hands, trying to rid myself of that shimmering, but it remained and seemed as though it almost entirely disappeared if I were to move my position, even by a millimeter. In that exact spot too, I noticed it was as if my ears could only hear the smallest of sounds. A faint and soft bell that both seemed very near and so far, and kind of a rapid fluttering and maybe even a soft giggle. Suddenly I felt a kind of burning, tingling sensation in my legs as I was crouched low to the ground, and as I tried to move ever so slightly, it felt as though a force brought me to the ground and into more brambles trailing through the long grass. All the surrounding sounds came rushing back, the breeze, the birds, the distant sheep, and I frantically looked around for that moment, frozen in time. But everything seemed once again a maze of grass, vines and thorns. I spotted the foxglove, although now the flowers seemed to be just green buds, not yet opened, and I wasn't convinced it was even the same one. It was very hard to leave that spot, as I wanted so much to feel that sensation again. Such a beautiful moment of being suspended in time, it felt like a kind of hypnosis. This is the first fairy portal I had discovered. Fairies exist across the world in many different forms and contexts. Big and small, they are fickle and curious. Their motivations often a mystery to us. Nothing is fixed or permanent. Some can be malicious and others playful or even helpful. They are also changeable and confounding, taking offense easily and unexpectedly. The world of the fae is a precarious space for the human mind. They can occupy many different forms, some that we may perceive as beautiful and others that we may consider much less so. One thing is for certain though, in this liminal space we are at the mercy of their whims, being neither good or evil, but rather behaving in accordance to their mood and inclination. It is said that when the fae do interact with the human world, it is far more common for them to be found with a lone traveller or farmer rather than some member of nobility or notoriety, and if they do, it is often to test their moral character. Pay close attention to your surroundings and you may find that you have been gifted something by the fae. A flurry of petals falling around you that would otherwise not be, a beautiful stone different from all the others around, light glistening on a pathway you never noticed before despite living in a place most of your life, or even an item long lost suddenly exactly where it should be. This is that liminal space between us and the fae. I headed out to pick some oranges and lemons in a nearby abandoned grove. Most of the trees are half dead, but despite this they still produce fruit, even if only from one branch, holding onto the few rays of sunlight it can still reach behind the other trees that now overshadow it. I always have a queer sensation in this grove. I always feel as if I am being watched. I often nervously glance around, wondering if there are hogs observing me in the bushes or something more unusual and sinister. As soon as I enter the clearing, the jaybirds jump into the air, shrieking as they always do when a stranger approaches. The grove is hot and dry, despite still being spring, and any water sources are far away, making my encounter all the more strange. Despite this, there are lots of green foliage, rugged and used to the land. Large fat daisies cover the ground, giving a peculiar scent as I tread through the uneven, spongy soil, once completely saturated in water with the heavy rains of winter. It is nearing dusk, and the sun is slanted across the grove, but the air is cooling down. I feel on edge as I pluck the fruits from the trees, stopping to smell each one and glancing around as I do so. I fill my satchel to the brim and struggle to close the leather straps into their buckles. A sound filters through the air. It sounds almost like the thin, dry pages of a book fluttering in a breeze, only there is no breeze. I crouch to the ground, all at once alarmed, although I'm not sure why. As the last strong rays of light begin to diminish and project a pinky glow, something seems ever so slightly illuminated in the grass. I slowly stand and walk quietly towards it, treading so softly as to not make a sound to scare whatever insect it is away. As I get closer, I kneel in the grass, the stalks pressing against my skin. I'm surrounded by the strong, sickly musk of the daisies. There is suspended, ever so slightly above the cluster of flowers, a translucent wing. Or at least I think it is a wing. It is bigger than any wing I have ever seen on an insect. I sway my head slightly from side to side, looking for a gossamer, singular spider's web glimmering in the last light of the day, holding the wing in place. I see none. I reach out my fingertips to pass my hand through the space that seems to hold that wing in place, and am suddenly smacked in the forehead with something leathery and round. I cry out and immediately hear a sort of chortling sound, almost like a bubbling brook, as if someone turned on a tap and abruptly turned it off again. I gaze around frantically, my heart hammering into my throat. I look down at my knees in the grass and see I am completely surrounded by lemons and oranges. Frightened, and that is the only word I can think to describe my utter confusion, I look up and the wing seems to be vibrating rapidly. I am frozen, unable to move, trying desperately to understand. I slowly rise, trying my hardest not to make a sound. I turn in increments, although afraid to leave my back exposed to that large open expanse and that translucent thing. I take step after step, resisting the urge to run. When I finally make it back, having walked faster and faster as I left the grove and entered the path, I breathe heavily, finally able to process my fear. I take my satchel off, ready to place my hoard on the table, only it is completely empty. This was my second encounter of what I believe to be a fairy portal. I had been noticing as the days grew warmer and drier, an alarmingly high number of golden strands of hair around the surrounding lands that I could only assume were mine, being the only flaxen-haired being that wandered these parts, to my knowledge at least. The only other folks I had observed were the old man at the well and the occasional distant sound of children playing in the valley, although they seemed to stay well away from here. I assumed the strands of hair were the work of birds gathering materials to make their spring nests, but I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, as I had been absent-mindedly gazing across the valley or reading a book by the big oak trees. I would get this crawling sensation up through my neck that would permeate across my whole head. I then on occasion would feel a small but sharp sensation and quickly bring my hand up to my head to swat away some creature that had found itself lost in my locks. I would often go to Ivar and ask if there was anything in my hair, and he would always say there wasn't, but would always comment on a curious scent that he couldn't quite place. Floral and yet slightly humid too, like moss-covered stones, always in the cover of shade. I assumed this scent must be myself, always tumbling over roots and often found stroking the soft beds of moss and pressing my face up against rocks to see clearly the tiny creatures crawling across and around these small ecosystems. It had been some time since I had been to the old mill, long abandoned on a steep hill. We were in need of some nettles, and I was feeling in the mood for a roam and feeling quite ambitious about making some nettle and pumpkin soup. I knew the best spot for them was the path up to the mill. So I set off, leather gloves and a neat little pair of silver scissors in my satchel. I was looking forward to seeing the sea of nettles, often surrounded by butterflies, and the old mill, often occupied by lizards and who knows what other mysterious things. I was only ever brave enough to poke my head around the always open doorway and had never fully walked inside. As I walked up the hillside path, surrounded on both sides by tall swaying trees, the sounds of the valley melted away. It was eerily silent. It felt as though even the birds were stopped in a kind of reverent silence. I saw one or two hopping on the forest floor, but they remained silent and seemed a little nervous. I wondered if perhaps an eagle had flown over or some other animal had passed through recently. As I made my way up further, I thought I could see something at the opening to the Sea of Nettles, where the mill also resided. Some small branch had perhaps fallen, or a pile of leaves from the winter storms now past. As I drew up right close to it, I immediately froze in surprise. A shiver descended my spine and my scalp prickled peculiarly. I was looking at a perfect circle of braided flaxen hair suspended just above the grass in the pathway. The hair shimmered in the dappled light filtering through the leaves. The sight was so unusual, I widened my eyes as if to see more clearly or as if to make sense of what I was looking at better, trying to force my eyes to notice something that would help me understand. The most frightening thing was the knowledge that none other than a conscious and dexterous being could have crafted this. I was so overcome with the beauty of it. Every aspect seemed especially crafted and designed. Every hair seemed woven deliberately and carefully. Even those that were looser were not looser by accident. That much I could tell for certain. They were all carefully placed. I inched closer, trying to see the details of the hair strands, although I already knew they were mine. The exact shade and thickness, the exact length and straight texture. I then noticed a faint and distant sound of, I suppose you could call it music, although it wasn't like anything I had heard before. Something like chimes and bells and other sounds that I couldn't even imagine how they could be produced, and they seemed to be coming from behind a leaf that was in the center of the braided circle. I might not know much, but I certainly know better than to enter through any circles that I find out here in these wild lands. But it was very hard to resist. The hair was mine, and so I felt a kind of claim over it, and the music, it filled me with this warm sensation. I couldn't help but smile. I felt like I had gulped down some elderberry wine and was sinking into a kind of stupefied daze. I wondered what this music was for. The braided circle felt like something precious, something spiritual and representative, perhaps a celebration of something that I was about to rudely interrupt. I sat cross-legged in front of the circle, swaying back and forth, hypnotized. I could not pull myself away. And then it was nightfall. I looked up confused, in a panic. The braided circle was still there, glowing in the moonlight. But everything was completely silent and dark. I blinked rapidly, trying my best to see my surroundings, feeling uneasy about that circle silently observing me. It felt so present. I slowly began to stand up, my legs numb from being still for so long. As I tried to rise, I felt my entire scalp being tugged downwards. I gripped onto my roots and realized all of the hair on my head was being forced downwards. I sat back down and carefully turned my head to better see what was happening. Every single strand on my head had been tied to a blade of grass. I tried not to panic, but I started breathing heavily and felt my head spinning as my body filled with adrenaline. It would take hours to untie each strand, and beyond that, my fingers were not dexterous enough to even do that without ripping the ends of my hair. I managed to get my satchel that was still on my back and rummaged through it until I found my little silver scissors. and one by one I had to cut each strand, bending awkwardly to reach each one until I became a little more free. I noted that whomever and whatever had done this was, well, kind enough to only tie the very ends of the strands, so I did not lose too much. Once I was done, I stood and stepped away from the spot I had been tied, and in the moonlight glistened the threads of thousands of tiny strands of golden hair tied to each blade of grass. I realized upon seeing this, they formed a kind of embellished walkway up to that braided circle. Had I inadvertently been part of some kind of ceremony place for a fae queen? Exhaustion hit me. I didn't dare step beyond to pick any nettles. I clearly wasn't wanted here. I turned around and swiftly made my way back down the path and into the valley. This was the third fairy portal that I encountered. I didn't consider it at the time, but upon thinking about the event, I now wonder if I was in a way welcomed, not entirely, but the fairies deemed something about me worthy enough that they would harvest me for a special occasion. However, now saying that, perhaps they see me no more than cattle used for their hide. After this experience, I became quite nervous about venturing too far afield, but at the same time felt a kind of restlessness. I am the sort of person that wants to learn more about the things that frighten me. Wild boars are guardians of the forest, and there are many here. I often see their tracks in the mud and areas they have dug up and overturned stones. They search for roots to feast on and care for the forest and its inhabitants. I decided I would follow them and walk their paths. They seem in some way inherently fae. There had been a lot of heavy rain through the winter, the stream was bursting with water, and I would wake every morning with the sound of the stream falling onto rocks. It was nearing the end of winter, and I finally saw the first signs that the hogs had been near. Usually spending most of their time on the other side of the valley, they had finally taken the route around. I was collecting pine cones when I noticed the perfectly imprinted hoof marks and the path filled with overturned mud and soil. Small holes that had been dug with an eager hoof and then excavated with a soft snout. I abandoned my pine cones, laced my leather boots a little tighter, and prepared myself to traverse the terrain of the forest guardians. At first the path was one I was familiar with. I jumped over the large areas of mud onto little islands, following their tracks past ancient olive trees and oaks. Huge moss-covered stones were on either side, and the soil was colourful at times with deep red pigments, sometimes a thick pure clay, and other times crumbling yellow ochre. The tracks seemed all at once to veer off the path, and I noticed the brush at the side of the muddy path had something passed through it recently, and so I followed. It was much harder to follow them from that point, the forest floor covered in leaves and mushrooms. Soon enough, though, I found many areas cleared of leaves and explored and followed them through the dense foliage. Stumbling through a bush and trying to take care of my footing, I brushed the debris from my clothes and hair and looked up. I was in a clearing filled with some kind of fruit tree, leafless as it was not quite spring yet, but definitely alive. I touched one gently, noticing it was a deep reddish purple and was beginning to swell with buds that would soon be flowers and new delicate brightly green leaves. This grove seemed long abandoned, and the fruit trees neither recently pruned or cared for in many years. The branches reached up high and were tangled with each other, some branches long broken off from the weight of the fruit they had carried in previous years. As I looked beyond them, I saw it, that strange, special, and ghastly fae thing, and I couldn't help but let a little gasp escape me. Suspended in the centre of the clearing was a singular hoof, levitating with tendrils seeming to float upwards. The hoof looked so soft with a chestnut downy fur and perfectly clean. Something came over me, and it's hard to describe, a kind of longing and desperation. I rushed towards it without thinking, forgetting all my past documented experiences, and I clutched it to my chest. A force snatched it away from me, my arms flung outwards in front of me, and the hoof was now suspended a few meters in front of me. Stupefied, I just stared at it. It was so beautiful, so perfect. I looked down at my outstretched arms and noticed they were completely drenched in slippery mud, and as I lowered them, so was my entire body. My hair completely saturated with a thick, clay-heavy mud. It started sliding down the sides of my face and onto the grass. I looked up once again at the hoof and felt a kind of despair. The fairies did not want me, but perhaps that was for the best. They were mysterious and a little frightening. They existed in the world in a way I couldn't and perhaps never would comprehend. Perhaps it would even drive me to madness. But I wanted so much to stay with that hoof. If the hogs did not want me to find this fairy portal, then why did they lead me here? Certainly, they could have concealed the way if they felt necessary. This was the 4th fairy portal I encountered. After this time, I became very preoccupied with things more immediately surrounding my home and slightly less further afield. But once you come to understand something, you can't return, and I began to notice the smaller things around me. Things that were once commonplace, I seemed now to be able to identify the ones that were, well, fae. It is unfortunately far too common for one of my cats in particular to play around with anything they find that moves, even slightly. I have even found them staring intently at a slow-moving snail. I have begun to affectionately call them Goblin, as he seems to become wilder and resemble some sort of gargoyle every day. He does also have a very bad habit of catching prey I would much rather he leaves alone, namely newly fledged birds, which really upsets me the most. One particular day, while checking on my cabbages, I saw him staring intently at something near the end of the raised bed and emitting a low growl. Every time he tentatively placed a paw to it, he withdrew it immediately, shaking his paw as if he had stepped into cold water. I tore off a cabbage leaf to place in my basket and headed over to where he was, worried a hornet might be stinging him. And there I saw a peculiar thing. A worm. But a worm perfectly tied in a knot and kind of shimmering ever so slightly and floating perhaps a millimeter above the grass. A flush of heat ran through my body and up to my cheeks, and I knew immediately this was something definitely very fae. I froze, although managed to swat his paw away as I saw it reaching out once more to touch. I leaned my head in closer, and as I did, I felt I could hear the tiniest whispers coming from it. I knelt, wondering what to do or what purpose there would be for such a thing to be here in my garden. This time I decided to do something a little different. I reached out to one of my cabbages and plucked one of the tiniest inner leaves and placed it in front of the knotted worm. The whispering suddenly ceased, and I immediately stood, grabbed my goblin cat, and backed away, grabbing my cabbage-filled basket and heading back. I couldn't quite decide if this was a portal, but I immediately recognized it as a fae thing. Although much smaller and subtler, it was certainly very strange for a creature so commonplace. So this I consider the 5th fairy portal. There are certain plants strongly associated with the fae, and some that will even deter them, such as St. John's wort. Yarrow, a herb that is most commonly seen with the yellow or white flowers. It is associated with protection, love, beauty, and healing. Shamrock is another, more commonly known as a clover, of which we have entire fields covered here. I even found a four-leafed clover one year and pressed it into a book. Folks say that a four-leafed clover must be found by chance and not specifically searched for. It is associated with health, friendship, peace, and piety. Clovers in general are deemed to aid second sight, the ability to see the fae. Other significant plants are bluebells, tansy, foxgloves, violets, pansy, ragweed, primrose, and mushrooms. But there are many more, including trees as well. Wildflower meadows are becoming increasingly scarce. Since the 1930s, as much as 97% of these have been lost in the UK. Some of them are as old as medieval cathedrals. The belief in the fae is so strong that in some parts, folks that were ordered to cut down ancient oak forests refused, knowing these spaces to be sacred to the fae. These forests still exist to this day. These wildflowers and trees also add so much biodiversity to our nature, a sacred place for creatures to escape pesticides and monocultures. If you have a garden, I think it is a lovely idea to spread some wildflower seeds every year, and you never know, the fae may even gift you something. And so another curious fae happening, closer to home. I awoke, immediately clear-headed with the coolness of the night touching my face. Moonlight filtered through the tiny window. That's when the sound reached my ears of girlish voices singing in harmony. No words, just mouths gently open. That's how it sounded. It was so beautiful I couldn't even feel afraid, just deeply curious. I placed my feet on the wooden floorboards and made my way to the front door, the smooth stones of the step pressing against the soles of my feet. I opened the door and looked out at the open garden, moonlight gently illuminating the small white wildflowers around the borders. In the center of the garden was a small, soft, glowing thing. I placed one foot carefully in front of the other, the soles of my feet first feeling the cobbled ground and then the mossy grass. Not wanting to take my eyes off of it, I approached unblinking, the voices becoming clearer. The harmonies seemed to become more fervent as I approached. I was 2 steps away from that small glowing thing. It was a tiny white feather suspended above the long grass, hovering at my eye level, although completely unmoving as if frozen. I reached out my fingers, wanting to touch the soft, downy barbs. When my fingertips were an inch away, the feather immediately leapt into the air, and an eruption of giggles followed it, as it soared to a dark corner of the garden, where it became immediately frozen in place once more. I couldn't decide what to do, wanting to both touch that fae apparition and wanting to retreat back to everything I already knew to be unchanging. Of course, I stepped forwards towards those beautiful harmonies, transfixed by that perfectly white quill. I reached out once more, but this time I dove after it. I leapt into the air, spurred on by the giggling, ringing like bells throughout the garden. I leapt again and again, but each time the feather deftly bounced away from my fingers. Exhausted, I collapsed into the grass, looking up at the sky, and as I slowly blinked, the feather was right there in front of my eyes, perfectly still, not even my laboured breathing moving its barbs. A shimmering sort of light filled the space around me, and I heard two voices. What a strange human. Should we let her have it? I've never seen one jump about before. Yes, let her have it, and she'll be confused for days. Yes, that sounds fun. I love it when their faces bunch up in confusion. Giggling fills my ears, and a jumble of sounds I could only assume were some sort of language, littered with the ringing of bells and chimes. The feather fell onto my face, strangely heavy, thick and soft. I was left in darkness. Even the moonlight seemed to have disappeared. I held the feather in my palm, closing my fingers around it so it couldn't escape, and headed back into the house and under my duvet, shivering from the cold air. I awoke, the sun filtering in through the tiny window. My fist bunched up, sticking out of the covers. I unfolded my fingers, and there was the feather, still perfectly white, soaking up the morning light. Excitement washed over me. Do I have some sort of key to the fae now? This is the 6th fairy portal I have encountered. I have at the very least encountered beings willing to interact with me, even if for their own amusement. It was midday. The sun made everything brightly crisp, and as I walked through a cluster of cork trees, I noted how dry the ground felt beneath my feet. Even the birds were silent, and taking solace in the shade of the bushes. As I entered the open meadow beyond, I saw something glimmering in the grass. It looked like a gem or a piece of jewellery dropped and lost, perhaps early this morning, although by whom I had no idea. Perhaps a crow had found something to steal in the nearby village. I went to collect it, being someone that loves collecting little trinkets I find in the forest. There I marvelled at a perfectly spherical dewdrop that still remained on a curved blade of grass. It seemed impossible it could still be there. Any moisture that had descended in the dawn had long disappeared. As I bent down to take a closer look, the sunlight that passed through it began to project more light onto the leaves around it. I looked even closer, fascinated by its perfection. It was as if it became magnified and I could see within it, because when I tried to see my own reflection, at first all I could see was something swirling inside. And in there I thought I could see something moving slightly. It became clearer and seemed to take over my vision entirely. As if peering into a clear pool of dark water, I saw what I thought were two girls. One kneeling, her arms slightly stretched at her sides, wearing a loose white dress as if she had just wandered out of bed and into the night, a long thick braid falling over one shoulder, her eyes gazing outwards. She looked at me, sorrowful and almost slightly accusatory. In her lap rested the other girl's head, her hair trailing across the knees of the other and onto the grass. She seemed to have no clothes. I gazed around them. They were surrounded by long grass and foxgloves, and in the distance beyond them, some sort of hill with a steeple rising out of the top, the sky clear with a full moon, clouds illuminated by it. As my eyes passed again across the face and posture of the kneeling girl, I noticed she had two small, translucent wings protruding from her back. As I slowly blinked and opened my eyes, I was staring once again at the sphere on the bent leaf. This was the 7th fairy portal I have encountered. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed our exploration into the threshold of the Fae, and that you were not too unnerved by what could be hiding under the leaves and the pathways you're so used to treading. My name is Emily, and I am a dip pen and ink artist that is also exploring doll making and sculpting. Folklore is a huge part of what inspires me, and if you have any fae or folklore you would like to share with me in the comments, please do, I would really love that. I have an online shop where I sell prints of my work and my own self-published illustrated fairy tale, and I am filming and uploading process videos of my illustrations and creations weekly or bi-weekly depending. I am really enjoying creating these videos, and I just wanted to thank you for all your support so far. Take care.